But how do you actually create a class? I'm talking about classes as your own type. Yes, think of a class as defining your own type, and you're going to use this new keyword class. Just like we used def to define a function, we use the keyword class followed by a name of the class and a colon, and then a suite of or a block of lines that make up that class. And the way I want you to think about what a class actually is really just a bundle of data, and two things in particular, of class attributes, which are really this kind of data like a strength level or a name or some sort of information, and also class methods, which are functions that are tied specifically to this class. Today we're going to focus on attributes more, and in lecture 25 we'll focus much more on methods and what you can do with them, class methods. But I wrote this out here, this last line, to make sure that you get used to these particular words because you'll hear them come up a lot in computer science classes and in industry. The class definition, which is what this block here is, that serves as the template for instances of that class. And then what do we call instances of the class? Well, an instance of a particular class is called an object. And I'll continue to use that vocabulary throughout this lecture and the next lecture, and you'll continue to hear it further on as you take more classes or read documentation online. This might be a little easier to parse and understand if we look at an example related back to our game. So here we saw how for our game we actually use a class and create a character, in this case an instance of the character class, so this is an object. Yes, one last thing before I show you how we do this with like what our class looks like for a character. The class definition that I showed up here is made up of a suite of lines. It almost always has this special method defined called init, underscore underscore init underscore underscore. And we'll focus much more on these class methods in lecture 25, but for now, I want you to know that this underscore underscore init underscore underscore method is a special class, a special class method called sometimes a constructor, because this is the method that gets called when you actually create your class. When you do class name, open parenthesis, and some stuff, close parenthesis, this is the method that gets called and handles setting up the class for the first time, or organizing the data that you've given it into however, like this object that you're creating. And it'll always have the self parameter as the very first thing. You don't need to worry about that. You don't pass anything in. You pretend it's not there when you call your function. And I'll talk about why you do that in the next lecture. But after that, it's followed by parameters, which are the parameters that you're then going to use inside of the body of this init function to set up your object. So let's keep going and see what this looks like for our character class. So here I have a character class character, and we have this init method that I was just talking about, which is the method that gets called when you actually when you go about creating a new character. And you can see what it does here. So given a character name, strength score, and a defense score, it'll set the health to 100, self.health equals 100 for our character. And then it'll set the name to be whatever name is given, our own strength to the strength that's given, and our own defense to the defense that's given. And you can maybe kind of get a sense of what self is doing here. Self refers to this particular instance of our object. And so this self dot something equals, that assignment is setting the value of this variable for this particular instance of our character. And then over here we have an introduce function that again takes self, but when you actually call the function by doing instant.introduce, you don't have to pass in self. And it handles printing, hi, my name is, and then your own name. Now, how do we create our class instance if this is our class definition? Well, to create an instance of a class, all we do is we call the name of our class just as if it was a function. So the name of our class here was character. And our init method, or our constructor, takes in, beyond the self parameter, which is always there and we don't have to pass anything in for it, it takes the character name, the strength score, and the defense score. So here we're creating two different characters, Woody and Picky. I call the second one Picky just because it seems like he has a pickaxe. I don't know about maybe Goldie would be a good name because he's got like gold stuff on his arms. But Woody here has a strength of 15 and a defense of 7. And Picky I gave a strength of 12, probably not as strong as a lumberjack, but a defense of 8. And now we have two characters, Woody and Picky. And as I've been saying, when you call this like constructor, when you actually type the class name and then open parenthesis, which is how we create an instance of our class, this is calling that init method. And we can see what actually happens here. If we look at Python Tutor, it creates an instance of the character. You can see here, you can see it's an object. So on the right here, we've always been thinking about frames. And now we're thinking about objects. And puts all these values into our object. Let's take a look at what this actually does, like if we visualize it in Python Tutor. So this is putting together the code where I showed you how to use classes and also the code on how to define classes. So I'll make this a little bigger as we step through here. So the very first thing that happens is this class block gets executed. And you can see now that in the global frame, character is now a variable that we can reference. In this variable, it's actually a function. So it points to this like character class, and in particular to this init function. And so now when we want to go create an instance of our class, so create an object, we have this line here, character Woody 15.7. And so when this is called, when we go to create a class, you can see exactly what happens here. So our code jumps over to the init method, and self, this first parameter, is a special parameter. We didn't have to pass it in. It gets passed in automatically because you're calling creating a new character. The init method is special, and it passes in this a brand new empty instance of our character. And then the body of our function goes through and line by line sets values on self. So going through, self.health gets set to 100. And so you can see in this character instance, not in the local frame or in the global frame, but in the character instance itself, we add health and 100. And then the next line does self.name equals the character name that we passed in. So Woody, strength is 15 and defense is 7. So now we have a class that's been created that has all of these values that have been set called attributes, which we'll talk about in a minute. And now that we have kind of in our global frame, the variable Woody now is pointing to this instance of a character here, we can now reference these values or attributes by using this dot notation. We can print Woody.strength, which is 15, and that gets printed out up here. And then going on, Woody.health prints out 100. Woody.name and Woody.defense and Woody.introduce. Just as we run through here, all these things got printed as expected. And this Woody.introduce we'll talk much more about in our lecture 25 and talk through what happens here. Now, back to our slides. One last thing to point out about these classes here before I start talking about attributes more in depth is about style. Just like everything up to this point in the class, there are certain rules that you have to follow for Python to be able to compile. And those rules are mainly the same variable rules that you're used to, which is your class name can't start with a number. It can only be made up of characters and numbers and underscores, so on and so forth. The same rules apply. But here, the style conventions are different for classes than they are for functions, specifically so that we can easily tell whether something is a class or a function based on the style rules that it follows. And so the naming conventions that I want you to follow here, and that are followed at Google and in general in most people's code, are as follows. So mainly just know these class names are always upper camel case. Remember, our function names and our variable names were always snake case, meaning each word was separated by underscores. Whereas our class names here are upper camel case, meaning that whenever you have something that you want to represent, like a team roster or movie metadata or a very long class name, you take all of those words, you capitalize the first letter of each, and you just concatenate them together with no underscores. And so a team roster class should be called team roster, capital T, capital R, no underscores, so on and so forth.